Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Bayliss Library, a member of Superior District Library. My name is Ken Miller. I'm the director. Welcome to this Great Michigan Read program, and thank you for author Steve Luxenberg. We appreciate it very much. I'd like to introduce Carla Grando, who's the program officer from the Michigan Humanities Council. Carla, back in the back. And yes. Kate Bartig, Communications Officer from the Michigan Humanities Council, also in the back. I'd like to recognize Bonnie Canusto, who's the Office Supervisor and Customer Services person for Hiawatha Behavioral Health, who are co-sponsoring this program tonight and the one this afternoon. We are honored to be chosen to host the 2013-14 Great Michigan Read author Steve Luxenberg. His book, Annie's Ghosts, A Journey into the Family Secret, was chosen by a statewide selection committee for this honor. If you haven't seen this reader's guide, it's out on the table, out in the lobby. It really is helpful for information about the book that will supplement what Steve has to say tonight. Steve is a Washington Post Associate Editor. His book, Annie's Ghosts, was a 2010 Library of Michigan notable book. It's a story about family secrets, personal journeys, genealogy, mental disability and illness, poverty, and immigration. There's a connection to the Sioux since Steve's aunt Annie spent over a year in the Sioux State Hospital, adjacent to the present Lake Superior State University. Please join me in welcoming Steve Luxenberg.
So I don't think Bonnie is actually here right now, right? Good, because the desserts are better tonight than Hiawatha. No, I shouldn't do that. But I'm looking forward to those desserts. In fact, if you don't mind, I might, like in the middle of the talk, go over and grab. I welcome you to do the same. It's okay.
There's some bread pudding right here just for you.
It's an inside joke. I might suggest that the finish of my talk, and before we take questions, that I really want to have this be a discussion, that we do a break and that you go and get yourself a sugar high so we can continue until a little later. It's a little disconcerting because I have some visitors here from Marquette who were here this afternoon, and I have the Great Michigan Read people in the back, and I don't want to repeat myself. And I know that I'm going to, so bear with me here. They'll tell you already said that, Steve. But thank you for coming. I mean, to have people come 3 hours from Marquette is a real honor. So let me tell you about the Great Michigan Read a little bit. Ken quickly told you it was chosen, statewide selection and all that. It was a remarkable thing to be called or emailed at first by Carla, and to be told without any warning that the book had been chosen as the Great Michigan Read. Not only is it a great honor, and of course it's going to sell a lot more books, and please let me get in touch with my inner marketer here. By the way, the percentage that goes to the library, you heard Ken talk about that, no percentage goes to me. So you don't have to worry that you're going to make me rich by buying the book. It's really not going to happen. There are a lot of really great Michigan books. I mean, it's a state that's not only rich in its natural heritage and its environment and all the wonderful places that we can go on vacation, but it's a place that's rich in writers. And to be chosen from all of those books, to be allowed to come and meet people all over the state and to have a night like this, it's as thrilling for me as it is for you. Writers write to be read. There's a reason why we call it the Great Michigan Read and not the Great Michigan Write. And if you don't read the book, borrowing it from the library is perfectly fine with me. You don't have to buy the book. Then our stories, go nowhere. And so libraries like this, the Bayliss Library, all those shelves out there are a place it's a home for the stories that writers like myself put out there and give us a life long after we've left the stage. And that's really important to me as a writer. One of the most daunting things, by the way, when you're writing a book for the first time, I'm working on my second book now, but when I was writing this book, is I love to go to bookstores. I mean, I used to love to go to bookstores. Now I go to bookstores and I look at these thousands of titles in front of me and I think to myself, why would you put another book out among all of these books and put yourself out there like that? But of course, we write because we want to be storytellers. I could talk about many things. You heard that list of kitchen sink items that Ken went through about what the book is about. I didn't know they were about some of those things, by the way. He reminded me that I wrote about that. But I can't give a talk about all of those things. So I've concentrated to talk a little bit about the Sioux, because that's where we are. How many of you knew before reading the book, or how many of you actually have already read the book? It's a lot of people. How many of you knew that there was a hospital here in the Sioux for a temporary amount of time? And what's wrong with the rest of you, right? We talked about this afternoon, but one of the things that I think is true is that the hospital, as Jim Dwyer reminded me, he did much better research about the hospital than I did. In fact, you should look, you're going to see one of the photos here, but look at those photos if you have a chance later on. One of the things that Jim reminded me is that the Sioux's patients during that 5-year period did not include any residents of the Sioux. They came from all over the state. That meant that the hospital, other than as a source of employment, didn't have much connection to the community. And so that's why I think its brief history, and also because it was very brief, has been lost to this community. And so the story of why that hospital was put here was not very complicated. The US Army had a base that it wanted to mothball. The buildings were available. The state desperately needed a place quickly to put its overcrowded patient population, and so 2 + 2 = 4, and that's how people ended up here. As I go along here, if you have a burning question, go ahead and ask it. I mean, let's make this into a conversation. So it's always important when we're talking about mental health to get the diagnosis correct. Does anybody know what this diagnosis is, or this condition? Oh. I hope not, because I made it up. I really don't like PowerPoints. I think they cause audiences to go to sleep. I'm going to put some slides up here. I will not read them to you. You can read for yourselves. Mostly they're photographs. Mostly they're a way for you to visualize the story that I'm telling. But I am the point. The screen is not the point. It's not going to change very often, and there's not very many slides. I've only picked out things that I think that you will not. That's an additional diagnosis. I know you've all had dinner and you're about to. So I hope I don't put you to sleep. If you find anybody falling asleep, please shake your neighbor and wake them up. So it's important in talking about this book to talk a little bit about the nature of secrecy. And why do writers write stories? We write stories, yes, because we want to make a lot of money and become famous, but in addition to that, we want stories to be universal. And if you read this story and you felt that I was writing only about my family, please don't tell me, because I'm going to feel like a failure. That's not what writers try to do. We try to write universal stories, stories that appeal to everyone. Stories that you can identify with, even if you can't identify with the individuals or the characters in the story, but you can understand and you can visualize the people that you've been talking about. My mom in this story, who I see my mom as being the focus of this story, even though it's called Annie's Ghosts. It's her secret that animates the story. My mom is any woman who was confronted in the 1940s with the conditions that surrounded her, with immigrant parents and a disabled sister. My aunt, Annie, is any disabled person who was forced into a hospitalized setting for her treatment. And I'm any son who has inherited the stories that get passed down, or in this case, don't get passed down, through the generations. So I see it as a universal story, and I tried to write it in a way that would at least give you a shot at feeling the same way. Secrecy, I thought a lot about secrecy as I wrote this book, and since I've given a lot of talks in which people have shared, if not secrets, then their own family stories. And it's important that we think about secrecy as both having good parts and bad parts. good secret would be hiding your Jewish heritage and surviving the Holocaust the way my Aunt Anna, my cousin Anna, did in this story. Bad secrets are ones that aren't bad because the secret itself is bad. It's bad because it's harmful to somebody. Denying the existence of a sister would be a harmful secret, at least on its face. Feeling guilty about it for most of your life, as I think my mom felt about her secret, would also be a damaging secret. The only problem with secrecy is that you can't get rid of it, because if it continues to be a secret, you can't deal with it. I didn't understand my mom was holding a secret, so I couldn't help her at some crucial moments in her later part of her life, where if I'd understood why she was, well, let's not say why she was, if I'd understood that she might be behaving a certain way because of the secret that she was holding, it might have been easier for me to have helped her. I think that's true in a lot of families. I think the dynamic of secrecy can affect families because you're not talking about what the real issues are. And I think that's a factor also in helping somebody who might have a mental health issue if you don't really understand where it's coming from. The reason I say that every generation creates its own secrets is because conditions change. So in the 1940s, perhaps mental health was something you didn't talk about a lot. And of course, not talking about something isn't the same thing as holding a secret. Secrets, it seems to me, there's sort of two sides of a coin. You might argue on one side that privacy is a benign nature of secrecy. On the other side is the damaging secrets that I referred to. What's a benign nature of secrecy? Well, if I don't feel like telling you about my family, I don't have to tell you about my family. That's my problem, that's my business. But if I'm hiding it because I'm embarrassed or I feel shame or there's a stigma, then that's where we get, I think, into the damaging part of secrecy. Secrecy, though, overshadows this whole story, and that's why I begin there. The reason I put this up is because I want you to think about why secrets persist and why the damage persists. I do feel like I'm repeating myself from this afternoon, so forgive me, Marquette contingent. But we don't choose where we are born. We don't even choose to be born. We don't choose the family we get born into. We don't choose the things that have come before, and yet they can affect us because we're raised by parents who have a certain set of conditions and attitudes and values. And so that's why these stories can cascade down through other generations. Then there's also the issue of a genetic basis for a physical illness or a genetic basis for a mental health issue. Not all, obviously, physical and mental conditions are genetically based, but that's why there's a connection, I think, between these generations. So I think about myself as being the inheritor not just of genes, but of the stories that we tell, to borrow from Sarah Polley's movie. By the way, please come if you can, and you're not doing anything else, to see this movie that Sarah Polley has done. It's an extraordinary film. It's better than this book that I'm talking about. So you've seen this photo if you've read the book. And the reason I put it up there is that I love this photograph. I love it as a writer as much as I love it as a son. And I love it because you can, why is the bottom cut off? Well, it says 1943 on the bottom. I don't really care about my mom's ankles. Because you can just describe it for several paragraphs as I did in the book. And I was inspired. Somebody once asked me in Boyne City, what inspired me? One of the students asked me. The New Yorker writer Roger Angell, who writes about baseball, once led a story about Steve Blass, a Pittsburgh Pirate pitcher, who won the World Series and 3 years later was totally out of baseball. He was the best pitcher in baseball in 1979, and by 1982 he was no longer playing. And he started it with this famous photograph of Blass leaping into the arms of his catcher, framed in the background by a man raising his arms in exultation after the last pitch. It was a strikeout. And his arms were on the side of Blass and the catcher. And he took 2 pages to describe this photograph. And the photograph wasn't published. He only had his description of it.
Oh my goodness.
And it was an inspired piece of writing because I could see this photograph. And he imbued it, of course, with all of the themes that he wanted you to think about as you started to read this piece about somebody who goes from a tremendous success to a downfall. There was no drugs involved. It wasn't that kind of downfall. He just lost his ability to pitch well enough to stay in the major leagues. Well, this photo reminded me of that because it's a moment in time, 1943. My mom is 24 years old, 25 years old, and she's happy, apparently. I know now that 3 years earlier, her sister had been sent to Eloise Hospital outside of Detroit, and then my mom became an only child sometime in that period. 3 things about my mom. Her name was Beth, she was an only child, and she always told me to tell the truth. No. She wasn't an only child, her name wasn't Beth, and she didn't always tell the truth. But I really liked getting to know my mom in this period, and this photograph helped me think about her in that period, down to the rolling waters of Lake Michigan in the background, and the insane idea that in heels you could stand on this chaise lounge. I mean, that's just crazy, but my mom, that's what she was doing that day. And I like the way her shoulder is like, one of them is back and one of them is forward, but there's also kind of an awkwardness about her arms, because she's probably trying to keep her balance. I can go on metaphorically about a woman trying to keep her balance as she's creating a whole story about herself. But that's the way, of course, writers think. So, I was asked in Boyne City the other day by a student, where did I start in this story? How did I start to research this book? And I started with my mom and her effects, the things she left behind after she died in 1999. I didn't start writing the book until 2006, but I spread all of the documents, there weren't very many, out on my desk, and I started to try to figure out who is this woman who I thought I knew, but in fact had held this secret. Well, there were only two documents that my mom had before 1943 when that picture that you just saw was taken. 2 documents. Now, some of you are a little older than 25, maybe? But I bet you those of you who are a little older than 25 pull out a few more than 2 documents from before you're 25 years old. So as I wrote in the book, if you remember, the sentence was, my mom does not exist before 1942. Because that's her wedding day. There was lots of photos from her wedding day. 42 is where I chose. I wrote that sentence because of this moment of sitting at my desk and trying to figure out who she was and realizing, Mom, where are you? You're not here until 1942. So there were 2 things, though, that were from before 1942. One of them was this photo. My mom at 4 months old. Which didn't, writers talk about getting information from photographs. The only information I got from this photograph is that my grandparents had a terrible taste in photo studios. That shag rug just does not do anything for this beautiful looking baby. Yeah, sheepskin, something like that. The other document is her birth certificate, which you really can't get along with in American life without a birth certificate, so she had to have it. And of course, this is where I learned after her death that her name was Bertha, not Beth. Let's see, I have to. No way I can change it. All right, what it says is Bertha, not Beth. Well, how many people here are named Bertha? Didn't think so. I mean, my mom was certainly not the first person in the world to change her name, but changing her name and never telling you that her name was something else is something different. And it's all part of this invention of identity that my mom went through. Identity being a very important theme in the book, in my letter review. All right, so I want to put you all back in high school. What is a historian's first duty, in your opinion? Anybody have a thought about how you would describe a historian's first duty? Accuracy. Yes, certainly that's a first duty. Let's say the first duty among equal duties. Any other thoughts?
Research. Preserve.
Preserve. You guys are one-word masters. Here's my version. Very hard to do. I am spending my days not in Boyne City and Sault Ste. Marie, but in the mid-19th century, in places like Marshall, Michigan, and Evansville, Indiana, and Louisville, Kentucky, trying to imagine the world as people in the mid-19th century, for my second book, saw the world then. And it is very, very difficult, because not only didn't I live there at that moment, I didn't even live in a time when there was no such thing as a car or a telephone, or a railroad was the common way to travel, or steamboats on the Ohio River. And I find myself frustrated that I can't feel what they feel, I can't smell what they smell, I can't see what they see. But this is the way that historians have to write, because otherwise we end up judging the past by the present. And that's not very helpful. If I want to write an essay about how I feel about the past, that is perfectly fine. But if I want to write a history of the past, I've got to see the world, I've got to recreate the world as it was then. Annie was one of the hardest subjects to recreate, because not only am I not disabled, at least not the way Annie was, I might be disabled in other ways. We all have disabilities, I think. I wasn't able to really inherit or inhabit her life the way I would like to. I remember reading one review online at Amazon. I didn't like the sentence I wrote, where I wrote, needing to inhabit Annie's body. They somehow didn't think that was a good sentence. I don't know why, I kind of like that sentence, but I really felt like I needed to see the world as she saw it, and that was very difficult. So I went to the school that she attended. It's one of my favorite passages in the book. Do you remember that passage? About going to the Oakman School for Crippled Children, as it was called then. And it's a little bit about the writerly process in trying to tell you how I came to understand, how I try to understand her world as she might have seen it. So I want to just read a little bit. I don't like reading from my book terribly much, but I'm going to read this one thing. On a long drive to the school, located on the city's west side, I wonder if there's any purpose to my visit. It's unlikely that Oakman, the equivalent of a junior high school back then, has any yearbooks or records of Annie's 6 years there, ending in 1937, when she was 18 years old. She only got a diploma of the routine history. The routine history was that in the records at the Eloise Hospital. Quote, because it was felt that it would encourage her, not because she had actually accomplished this level of work. As I approach Oakman's front door, I have the impulse to turn around and head back to the car. What am I going to say when I enter the main office? Hi, I'm looking for a student who was last here 68 years ago. The school staff is going to think I've lost my mind. Annie might have been here once, but she's here no longer. How wrong I am. No written record of Annie exists, but as a kind assistant principal gives me a tour, pointing out the original wooden handrails running the length of every hallway, I have no trouble envisioning Annie on her way to class. Amid the school's usual cacophony, the hum of 100 voices, the giggles and shouts and light taps of quickly moving shoes, I can hear the click and thwud and swoosh of crutches, prosthetic legs, and wheelchairs on linoleum. I should remind you that it's still used as an orthopedic school. I can't hear my aunt's voice or ask her any questions, but I can see her phantom figure, the brace on her useless right leg, struggling as best as she can manage with either crutch or handrail, pushing herself. Please tell them that I'm a great speaker. Pushing herself forward, a disabled Sisyphus on her unending journey. So as a writer, I like that description because I'm also being honest with you about what I don't know, what I can't know. And when I teach a writing class, one of the things that I tell the students is, every story, and I mean this, every story has weaknesses. There is no story that is perfect except ones written by Hollywood screenwriters. The job of a writer, the challenge of a writer is to take that weakness and make it into a strength. Make it part of the story. That's what I was trying to do with this passage. It's a weakness that I can't be Annie, that I don't know how she spent her days. And I try to make it into a strength by, one, telling you that and making you my companion on that journey, and then two, actually using it to tell a little scene about Annie as I try to imagine her life. So that's a little bit of how the writerly process, at least through this writer's eyes, works. You see this from the front of the book. This is the actual court record. Court records are open, it's not a medical record, it's a court record, even though it has medical information in it. And this is what I received when I went down to the Wayne County Probate Court when I asked for any records relating to a woman named Annie Cohen. If I were giving a research seminar, which I'm not going to do, I would say every piece of information on this small, not very large, not 8.5 by 11, this is smaller than that. Every piece of information is important to your research effort if you just can understand what it's talking about. So I paid attention not to just this, but to June 12th and May 22nd and May 8th, because they're giving me a timeline if I just can understand why somebody would write in the margins those dates. Now, as it happens, those are the dates of the hearings that were set to decide whether Annie should be hospitalized, but she should be declared not just allegedly insane, but actually insane. This may be hard to read. Can you see it in the back? Can you see it, Carla? So this is the actual petition that unfortunately cut off by however the projection is going. You'd see my grandmother's name at the bottom there, where she signs her name. But I want you, because you're all smart people who are going to think just the way I do, read the 5 sentences, since you can all see it, that the petitioner, my grandmother, is telling the court why Annie should be hospitalized. And tell me what you think about, tell me anything you think about. A patient imagines that someone wants to do her bodily harm, she talks to herself, she cries, laughs and cries for no apparent reason, she cannot carry on a coherent conversation, she assumes one position for long periods. What does that make you feel or think, or what's your first reaction to it? Speak up.
It doesn't necessarily sound like someone who's insane.
That's one thing that you might think.
I talk to myself all the time.
If you all weren't here, I'd be giving the same talk.
Sounds like
Who is
schizophrenia.
Sounds like schizophrenia.
Who is describing that? What does she mean when she cannot carry on a coherent conversation? Is she assuming that that is with her parents? And do they not want to? Is this kind of what they are using as a, who determined that this was not a coherent conversation? Is that, do her parents really want her out of the house?
My grandmother is the signer of this document, so presumably this is my grandmother talking. It's her description of her daughter. This is my grandmother's description of her daughter. So it's an interesting points you're making about what does it mean, coherent conversation, et cetera.
The last sentence maybe implies depression too.
You're focusing on the mental health issues, and that's very good. I have a different direction I'm trying to get to go in. Think about it more simply.
Well, I'm thinking perhaps because your grandmother was an immigrant, and I'm thinking that whoever filled this out, because your grandmother certainly didn't type this, is paraphrasing.
All right, now this man is on to something. My grandmother didn't fill this out because she can't type, because my grandmother, I didn't tell you that, but my grandmother is an immigrant, can't read or write English all that well. She certainly had never seen a typewriter in her house, in her apartment. But also look at the very first word.
Patient.
Now, all you moms out there are going to write nice things about your daughter, because the first word you're going to write is patient.
No.
Who uses the word patient?
Nurses and doctors.
Doctors, etc. So I am not trying to be clever here and show you that my grandmother didn't write this and some doctor railroaded Annie into the hospital. It's not the point. Might have happened, but it's not the point. The point is that my grandmother was advised that her daughter could receive treatment in a hospital and that she would benefit from that. And once she got into what I call that locomotive and it left the station, it was headed to Eloise. This was past the point of no return. Now, I think that my grandmother was trying to do the best for her daughter and that she thought that treatment in Eloise would be beneficial to her. But she wasn't carrying out the system. Once the system got a hold of the patient, the system was taking care of it, because in 1940, as I said this afternoon, the standard for mental health treatment in Michigan, the law, was that the state owed treatment to its mental defectives. It owed treatment. The standard today is you're a danger to yourself or to someone else. Very different standards. So the state of Michigan is owing Annie treatment. They've decided that Annie could benefit from treatment, as you'll see in a minute. And so that's what happened. All right, so this is not a genealogy talk. It's not a research talk. We're going to move on to the hospital itself. I love this photograph. It's a very evocative photograph. I wish I could tell you that I asked the photographer I hired to take it. She took it herself. She saw it. I didn't see it. That's why she takes photographs, and I write stories. Okay. I remember I said before that photographs provide information. There's nobody talking to us about this photograph. There's nobody, even the people in the photograph are all in the background except for this one woman over here. I don't know who she is. I don't even know if she's a patient or a nurse or some sort of a attendant. But let's focus on the 7 beds in the middle of the room.
Pretty crowded together.
Okay, pretty crowded together. You've been assigned bed number 4. What time do you go to bed? You go first because you can't get there any other way. Or maybe second if somebody's at
I think they were just pushed together like that because then
Because of the eating
now
at
there's
the-
room
at
for
the end of
eating
the
and
room.
activities.
That may be.
Because you would never do that. They would never do that in a ward of a
Well,
hospital.
Oh, no.
You've got to get between the
There's
beds.
2 beds here and there's 2 beds here, and you may be
Maybe
right.
that way.
I thought about it, and that's why I didn't say.
I worked in a ward at U of M hospital, and we moved the beds all around all the time when there weren't people in them.
Right.
But for,
But not 1940 either.
well, no, I wasn't there in 1940.
No, but I-
But I
She's
still
asking
worked
a
in
good-
a multiple bed ward when they still had
She's asking a
those.
very good question, which is you can't rely on this photograph to be a description of what happened in the evening. You can only rely on the fact that it was
I mean, we
taken at
moved
that
them around
moment
when
in
patients weren't
time.
in them, but.
Somebody, you're going to say something.
I was a nurse at Northville State Hospital, and I saw that.
You saw that,
With
okay.
patients
But if
in
you
it
look
though?
over on the right, it looks like there's spaces between beds on the right and the far right windows. It looks
That's
like
right.
there's-
Very good researching you're doing here. Extremely good. When were you a nurse at Northville?
Early 60s.
Okay, so my aunt was at Northville for the last portion of her life, from January of 72 to June of 72, and I'll tell you about that later. Northville, for those of you who don't know, the Detroit area was the hospital built in 1954 to help alleviate some of the overcrowding that was occurring, not just at Eloise, but at Ypsilanti and other hospitals in the Lower Peninsula. There's no way you can have a debate about what's happening here, though. These 7 beds were maybe not pushed together, but these people truly were sleeping on the floor. And the Wayne County commissioners who were responsible for Eloise Hospital, which was a county hospital, the only county hospital in Michigan, were not dumb. They invited the press in to take this photograph. They didn't put the patients on the floor, those were real. But the governor was not paying attention to their pleas for help in the overcrowding. And so suddenly on the front page of the Detroit Free Press one day, or the Detroit News, I can't remember which, this photograph appeared. It's also in the state archives, in the file of the governor's records. Because it was sent there by somebody who was so outraged at seeing this photograph that he or she scrawled on it, "shame," and sent it into the governor, and they put it in a file, and it got put into the archives. That's what was happening in Michigan's hospitals at the time, is there was a debate going on about what to do about the ever-increasing numbers of patients that they were expected to take care of under the state law that care and treatment was owed to its mental defectives. Didn't want to be sued, so
I've seen that same thing done less than 10 years ago in a correctional facility, not 20 miles.
corrections facility is very definitely,
Put people on the floor on a mattress, which was barely a mattress. And
which I won't get into this part of the talk at great length, but every generation thinks it's doing better than the previous one, and yet we have people sleeping on the floor in correctional facilities, and that doesn't sound like improvement. So we can't get too superior about how things are going. The date is cut off at the top, but you'll see that he's replying to a letter of July 3rd, 1945. So that's the date of this letter, is July of 1945. The temporary hospital opened in March of 1945. And it is a letter to Mr. Charles Wagg, who was the Deputy State Commissioner of Mental Hospitals. It comes from, I'm sorry it's cut off in this projection, it comes from the superintendent of Eloise Hospital. And they've already set down some rules about who's going to go from these crowded Lower Peninsula hospitals to the Sault. And the rules are, send us your best patients, the patients that need the least amount of care. For a good reason, I think, which is that we have a temporary hospital and an army barracks, and we don't have the facilities to give our best treatment to the patients who need it the most. So send us your best patients, and you keep the ones that are more difficult in your hospital. So here's what it says. My understanding that you are desirous that this institution furnish a total of 160 patients for this transfer, 32 of which shall be men, and half of the 32 men to be colored. An interesting addition. All right, so this letter, I want to tell you about the provenance of this letter. I wish I could tell you that I discovered this in some state archives and I'm a great researcher and all that. Much better story than that. Joe Johnson, who is the head of the Westland Historical Commission and the chairman of the Friends of Eloise, just like we have the Friends of the Bayliss Library, she's the Friends of Eloise. She's the keeper of the Eloise memory. And unfortunately, Jo is in her late 80s, and woe to us that she died, because she is somebody who is keeping this effort alive more or less by herself. She calls me one day and says, I just discovered a box of old documents at Eloise that somebody has overlooked, and it has some of Superintendent Gruber's old files, his correspondence. And I'm going through this, and she felt guilty because she had never been able to send me anything that's specifically related to my aunt. And lo and behold, I discovered this letter with your aunt's name. Now, I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, there's an old box in 2005 in Eloise? I mean, what do you mean you just discovered this box? I don't believe this. But I never found the answer out to why this old box was sitting there. This letter appears to be genuine because it fits with all the other facts that I knew at the time. So, remember I told you that you're supposed to send us the best patients, so he has to justify why he's sending them my aunt. That's what he's doing here. I mean, let's ignore the piano, which is a little strange story beforehand. We have two sisters who have a piano that belongs to them personally. We'd like to have the piano transported to the Sault. Boy, I don't know. I'm requesting authority to have this piano crated and shipped. Let me go on from the absurd to the sublime here. So there's one other institution, Annie Cohen, who has only one leg. However, she gets about the institution up and down stairs very admirably with this one leg and is able to take care of herself. I don't think so. But that's what he needed to tell them because he needed to send them his best patients. So my aunt spent 18 months in the temporary hospital, and she came back in the fall of 1946. All right, so we now can see the world a little bit from Annie's point of view. She's being ripped out of the home that she has lived in for her entire life. She's being sent 360, 70 miles away to the Sioux, across the bridge that doesn't yet exist. Let's think about it from my grandmother's point of view. My grandmother, who was taking 2 buses an hour to see Annie and Eloise. How many times does my grandmother get to see Annie in the Sioux? 0. She can't possibly come to the Sioux. There's no evidence that she did. I don't think she did. I don't know for sure. So maybe the reason that they shouldn't have sent Annie to the Sioux is not because she has a wooden leg, but perhaps because they shouldn't be sending any Eloise patients to the Sioux. It's just too far away. But families were not important in 1945 to the treatment of people who were institutionalized. The state was taking care of them. The state owed care and treatment to its defectives, and they were fulfilling that mission by sending Annie to the Sioux. They were taking care of her. That's the photograph back there. There is a credit on the bottom, Jim, but it's not being shown.
Where?
Jim provided me this photograph. Thank you very much, Jim. Jim is, I'm sorry to have made the last week of Jim's life hell. I kept asking him questions and he kept running out to take photographs for me and sending to me. There was some time and date stamps on those emails that I shouldn't reveal, because they took place at wee hours of the morning. Thank you very much for all your help. So these were the barracks that housed patients in 1947. I don't know that I can say that they weren't good conditions. Maybe Annie had a bed all by herself and not one in the middle of 3 or 4, or maybe there weren't any 7s. That's what we see in this photograph.
Steve, if I could mention, the 1 or 2 buildings actually left in the Sioux that still resemble them as they were then is Frenchie's Upholstery on 3 Mile Road. They have there's other buildings around the Sioux that...
Senior Center.
Yeah, well, no, not that one, not that one. That one's got vinyl siding. Yeah, that's the only building remaining in the original site. But Frenchie's Upholstery, he hasn't changed the building very much. It's got the original windows, the light fixtures, the interior, and if anybody wants to see what...
And Jim can give you, I'm not making fun of him, chapter and verse on all of the buildings. He really has done a great job of documenting where these barracks have gone. And it's interesting that these buildings are being reused. There's 1 building remaining on the site. It's the one to the left there, right, Jim? No.
Oh, no, sorry. Oh, that isn't there. Keep telling me where. No, it's not there.
Oh, isn't the one on the left, though?
No, that's the auditorium.
Oh, okay.
I scanned that one too, but I don't have a photo of it otherwise.
Okay, so I'm sorry that the top of this is cut off, but what it says is the pendulum's dramatic swing. The pendulum's dramatic swing. In 1955, there were more than 500,000 patients in U.S. hospitals who were being treated for a mental health issue. All right, so why did I use the term the pendulum swings? Because which is right? The 500,000 people in a population that is half as large as we have now, or the 40,000 we have now? Are we diagnosing correctly now and not then? Are we not diagnosing now, but we were then? These numbers don't add up.
Yeah, but in the 1980s, I was in medical school in New York, and we did our psychiatry rotation in some of these mental institutions. And it was at that time, in the early 1980s, when the burden of paying for this was too much. And so that's when all the people were released into the city, and many of them are now in the correctional facilities. And those are the ones that live in the street.
Right. I mean, you're telling us some very important history.
It corresponds with the incredible expansion of correctional facilities at the same time that they went down. We actually had the largest expansion of correctional facilities in the history of the world.
So let's talk a little bit about what happened before 1980. There was a revolution in mental health care in the United States that began in 1955. There's a reason why I chose that date. Why was that the peak? There was a recognition that this was too expensive. The system was unconscious. It was unsustainably expensive. It was unsustainably expensive in 1945. You were going to build hospitals forever if we kept doing things the way we were doing them. Have you ever heard somebody running for governor, and I chose governor because that's the head of the state government, who runs on a mental health platform? But they get into office and they look at their budget and they say, wow, we're spending a lot of money on mental health services. And that's what happened to the governor in the 40s that I was referring to in his files. The one that received the shame is that he was warned that he was headed for a crisis because of the overcrowding, and because mental health issues are not ones you vote on when you vote for governor, and he didn't pay much attention. 1955 was the introduction of medication in which patients could be treated for the first time at home. It was crude medication today that we don't use much of at all. Is that right? We don't use
Well,
Thorazine.
actually, unfortunately, Thorazine is great for hiccups. And, yeah. Haldol, unfortunately, is still used, but it shouldn't be.
And they've been replaced by a panoply of medications, and we can have a discussion some other time about the over-medicated society, if that's where we are. But that was the first time that patients could be treated at home with some expectation that that would be effective for the patients and perhaps cheaper for the government. And that was followed by a philosophical revolution. The first introduction of articles in which psychiatrists like Zaz said, no one is mentally ill. There's no such thing as mental illness at all. We're all on a spectrum, and those kinds of debates started to take place. And then that was followed by a legal revolution in which there were lawsuits, including one against Eloise Hospital, that essentially ended the Michigan mental health system as we know it in 1974, as the legislature was promising and then did rewrite the mental health code. Before that, in 1963, there was the passage of the Community Mental Health Act, which was underfunded, but nonetheless it started the notion that the least restrictive environment and treating people outside of large hospital settings. So from 1955, where we're at 500,000, by 1980, we have seen the closure of most of the large asylum hospitals in America to be replaced, in some cases, by nothing. That's why we have some people being not treated and living on the streets, and some people, and community mental health facilities that gradually have been funded better than they were in 1963. This photo is not back there. So this is a photo that Jim took, right?
Yeah.
And this is the same building, one of the same buildings. It's the only building remaining on the site. It was used as a senior citizens, it says club there, is that correct?
Yeah.
For a while. But this is the last remaining building on the site. And the water tower certainly will tell you, those of you who live locally, where it is. It says the site today and the one remaining building. So we've talked about where because you guys are smarter than I am, we already talked about where these patients have gone. They've gone to places where we're going to debate 50 years from now whether we were doing the right thing in 2013. So I want to return, now that we've completed most of the Sioux portion, return to this issue of secrecy. And then we'll take a break at 8 o'clock and we'll have some refreshments and then have questions. I gave you this rule before, and I thought a long time about it because it has to do with my mom and how the difficulty, once you've kept a secret for a long time, of being able to put yourself up for being judged. I think that's what my mom was facing. If she had told her children, hey, I've been keeping a secret all these years, at best she could have, I suppose, just said, well, I've gotten it off my chest. At worst, she has to endure the possibility that we'd ask a lot of questions and perhaps tell her that we're not really fond of what she did. It's not what I would have felt, but my mom, of course, didn't know that. I want to return, even though those of you who read the book know this portion of the book, but it's in the front of the book, and so it is the kind of emotional starting point, I think, for the story in many ways. But I want you to think about that day when my mom, now she had released her secret by telling us, somebody had asked her in the hospital setting. My mom had been treated in an emergency room several times in 1995 for her emphysema, but the hospital got wise and wondered why this woman kept showing up, and they were asking her a lot of questions. And a psychiatrist interviews her and said, well, tell me about your family history. And just like we all get asked every time we go to the doctor, what's your family history? My mom provides that history, except she doesn't say it's a secret. Had a sister, she was 4 and 2 and all the things you know. Of course, Annie was 21, my mom was 23, and my mom had grown up with Annie, and so even the first hint of the truth, which she didn't call a secret, so the psychiatrist didn't know it in 1995, even that wasn't true. She constructed another lie in order to relieve herself of any questions about what really had happened. 3 months later, she's in the hospital outside of Detroit called Botsford, and the psychiatrist who she had first spoken to had decided that she wasn't anxious. The anxiety medication didn't seem to be having much effect, but instead she was suffering from a depression, and that it would be better for her if she were to be given a medication that has as a slight risk respiratory arrest, which is not a great medication for somebody with emphysema. So he didn't want to give it to her at home. He wanted to have her in the hospital setting, and he wanted to monitor her. And the plan, was that she would be there for 2 weeks. If she did fine on the medication for 2 weeks, then she would go home. So we took her there on a Thursday night when they had a bed available. My mom was voluntarily committing herself to this psychiatric ward, this geropsychiatric ward. So it wasn't an issue of her being involuntarily committed. There was no court involved. Under the law, he had the right to keep her for 3 days, which he explained to her. That turned out to be a real issue with her 24 hours later. We went home, 7:30 in the morning, phone rings in her apartment where my sister and I are staying, and my mom's on the phone and she's saying, I can't stay here, you have to take me home. Now my sister, being much smarter than I am, had warned me that this was going to happen. And she told me that if mom starts begging you to take her home, and you do, it's on you, I'm out of here. Because I think that she should stay in the hospital. Now I love my sister dearly, and one of the reasons why I do is because she's quite an honest person. And you might think badly of her that she's basically saying, Stephen, you're on your own, but what she was really trying to say was, you're going to make the wrong decision and I'm not going to support you in that. So if you want to make that decision, you better be prepared for the consequences. The difference between the two of us is that I'm a much less certain person than my sister, and I don't react well to certainty. I react better to figuring it out as I'm going along. So we went to the hospital, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, so what's this day going to be like? And I wasn't really prepared for it. And my mom is essentially desperate. She's become like the child in the relationship, and I've become the grown-up. She's begging me, she's cajoling me, she even resorts to bribery, although she has nothing she can bribe me with, but she's trying bribery to get me to do her bidding. She wants me to take her home. And I'm temporizing, I'm stalling, because I don't know what the right thing to do is. I don't know whether this is a momentary emotion that she's suffering and she's gonna, in 3 hours she's not gonna be saying the same thing. I just don't know what to do. So we're spending most of the day in conversation, and sometimes she's sitting with me in the day room, in the sunroom, and sometimes she's sitting with the doctor, and and they're of course telling me things like, well, this always happens with people, it's a shock to come into a ward like this. And she keeps repeating the same sentence. Stephen, you don't understand. I can't stay here. And I, in my hubris, said, I understand. I was here last night when you checked in. I saw them take away the pencils that you use to do your crossword puzzles because they're not sure you're able to keep control of them and it might be a weapon. And I know that crossword puzzles are the life, they're like lifeblood to you. They prove to you every day that you can you could still think clearly. I saw the people who were suffering from some form of dementia and who are screaming in some apparently uncontrolled way and are quite frustrating to listen to. And I saw the other people who were here who seem to be much sicker than you. I know this is not a great place to be. I understand, Mom. I still think you ought to be here because I think in 2 weeks you'll have fared well with the medication and you'll be released. But I didn't understand. I didn't understand because I didn't know that Annie had, at that point I didn't know Annie's name. I didn't know that Annie had been committed to Eloise on a temporary commitment that was going to be about 2 to 4 weeks in duration. And I didn't understand that my mom feared that she was becoming her sister. I didn't understand that she had lived through something like this in a much more painful and difficult way than I could possibly imagine. So when she sank to her knees and grabbed me around my shins and begged me to take her home, it was a very difficult moment, but later on I realized when I was thinking about secrecy, was there a point in my mom's life where there was a greater motivation, a greater incentive to tell the truth than right at that moment? And yet she couldn't bring herself to do it. If she had said to me, Stephen, here's what was going on, I would have folded in a minute. She would have won the conversation. I would have said, Mom, you win, this is history, we're out of here. But she couldn't do that. Now, fortunately, she stayed only 2 weeks. And fortunately, the medication was effective and she went back to work and she lived another 4 years. And it all worked out for the best. And she kept her secret and never told it. But at that moment, I realized is when I thought these thoughts, which is that the secret controlled my mom at that point. She didn't control the secret. And that is the damaging nature of secrecy, I think, is when it gets to the point where you're no longer making the choices. The secret is making the choices for you. That's the end of my talk. Time for dessert. So who has the first question or comment, or additional comment?
Well, one of the things that as I was reading your book, and one of the things that constantly reminded me of the secrecy that the Kennedys kept with their daughter. And I just couldn't help but say, wouldn't it have been interesting to have a Kennedy, come through and write.
Yeah. Probably would have sold a lot better than my book.
No, I thought your book was very, very
I meant
intriguing.
It would have interested a lot of people.
That was the first thing that I thought about was the Kennedy family and the secrecy that.
There have been some, certainly there's been more written about it lately, but I'm not sure if there's ever been a whole book and somebody as dogged as I am digging through all those records. Kennedy, lobotomies, the Kennedy child had a lobotomy. Eloise did lobotomies for 4 years until they decided they didn't work, which was smart because they didn't. And thus we think, of course, that it's just totally barbaric to do lobotomies in the remember we had to think of ourselves in that era. Remember that the man who developed the lobotomy procedure was given the Nobel Prize for medicine in 1949. That's how much we thought about lobotomies then as being a possibly therapeutic tool.
I'll bring up the point that we talked about, plus also bring up another point. And
Forge your limit.
I'm only going to do 2.
Oh, okay. So you got two left.
I'm Jewish, and I bring up a point that I've always thought about is how can a religion survive for, I say 3,000 years, the time we left Egypt, if it didn't pick out the people who were obsessive compulsive. That's what I was told in medical school, is that we're all obsessive compulsive, and there's a spectrum, so I think that as we intermarry, we pass along genes that there are good traits and bad traits, but I also made the point that coming from Europe in the early 1900s, which my grandparents did as well, is that the thought that among religious Jews, you did not let anyone know that you had someone with psychiatric problems, because they obviously knew about the genetics, and they weren't allowed to marry not only the person who had mental health issues, but the other family members. So it might have put her your mother at risk for not being able to get married.
How many people come from a culture or a religion or a background where you feel that you just didn't talk about a psychiatric issue or other issues? I mean, there's some cultures, I think, where you gab about everything. In fact, a friend of mine who's a professor at Northwestern now has written a new book called Family Secrets. That's the main title, and the subtitle is Shame and Privacy in Britain, in modern Britain. But it's all about how Britain has gone from in this culture where you didn't talk about things 300 years ago, 200 years ago, 100 years ago, to this country now which gabs about everything. And she does a historian's view and a sociologist's view of how and why that's changed. And it's a fascinating book. It is. She's a very good writer. It's not an easy read because it's an academic book, but it's quite interesting. And she's gotten a hold of some wonderful archival information about when British men went to India in the late 18th century without their wives. They often had mistresses. They often fathered children. They abandoned the wives and they brought their children back to Britain because they felt they were responsible for the children. Why they didn't feel responsible for them? Well, wives, they weren't wives actually, they were mistresses. Well, it was kind of hard to hide these mixed-race children in Britain in the late 18th century, so they weren't secrets, but no one talked about it. But it's a fascinating book. I recommend it if you're interested in that.
When my dad was in Newberg State Hospital, they gave him shock treatments, which he hated. Did Annie have shock treatments?
I don't think so, but there were many people at Eloise who had shock treatment. And shock treatment was one of the most again, like lobotomies, it was regarded as being a great breakthrough when they first. And did he have electroshock, or did he have insulin shock?
No, I think to put him in the bathtub and. I don't know what it was supposed to do either.
Hydrotherapy.
Well, that was hydrotherapy, which was extremely cold water, hot water kind of thing, in order to shock your system. But the insulin shock, which I think if I can find it quickly, it's an amazing.
Well, they still do electroshock therapy.
Yes, and it's judged to be effective, they think, for some forms of
Depression.
Severe depression.
For depression, right. See, if you have me stay here much longer than 9 o'clock, you'll see how little I know about mental health issues. But so I interviewed a man by the name of Ed Miscavige, who no longer is living. He was the head of the men's psychiatric department at Eloise, and he never treated Annie because she was in the female part of the hospital. But I interviewed him, and he says to me, we were very pessimistic about schizophrenia in the 1940s. We didn't have good options. Very few patients responded to shock treatment, either insulin-induced. So they would inject you with insulin until your body essentially went into seizure. That was what insulin shock
Your
was.
blood sugar was so low.
Yeah.
That's what happened.
And I asked, would Annie have been a candidate for either? The shake of his head. Unlikely. Shock treatments were for the manic depressives and highly disturbed schizophrenics. And from what I've seen of her case, she wasn't highly disturbed. The longer she was there, the more her chances went down for release. The more chances went down. We tended to try it on newer patients. So he was sort of reassuring me that Annie wouldn't have had these things. But of course he was guessing just as much as I was, except guessing from a better base of knowledge than I was.
If your mother were alive and could have read your book, what do you think she would have said to you about it?
Well, she would have told Jude today she's very proud of me. Well, why did you write this damn book? It's such a complicated thing. I say this in all honesty. there were two things that could have prevented me from writing this book. And both of them have to do with kind of that first historian's first duty. If my mom and I had had a conversation about this story, this case, this secret in the 90s, I never would have written a book. Because it would have been her story, she would have been telling me all about it. The book only comes along because she dies and the mystery still exists, and I can write it as a mystery. But if the mystery gets taken away and my mom is possessing the story, and I think that's an important distinction. When my mom is alive, this is her story. When she dies, it becomes my story. I inherit the story. And it's only then that I feel comfortable even thinking about it as a book. I wasn't never thinking about it as a book in 1999 when my mom died, or even in 2000. It isn't until an agent tells me it sounds like a great story that I begin thinking, oh really? It really could be a book? That I start to think about writing it. The other factor is if my brother, the one who was skeptical about me doing the book, if my brother actually puts up a big fuss. I don't mean a big fuss like, I hate you if you write this book. I just mean if he was really opposed to it, and he made clear that he objected, as opposed to just disagreeing with me slightly, I just think I lose momentum on it. I don't want to annoy my brother, I don't really want to cause a family rift, you know, and so you need a lot of momentum to feel like you can write a book. And it's not because it's economically complicated, that's true, but because you spend 2 or 3 years doing it, and you don't want to spend 2 or 3 years doing something that you feel unsure and ambivalent about. But my brother never did raise those kinds of objections. We had several conversations in which he said, I don't know why you want to do this, and I don't look back, I look forward, and you're a backward-looking person, and all those issues that we had. But he never really said, I don't want you to do this, or he wouldn't have said it that way. Even if he had said, it really just stresses me that you're doing this, then I think I wouldn't have done it. But that didn't happen. And, you know, there have been people who said to me, I got an email recently saying, you're just exploiting Annie by writing this book. Now, I don't want you to disagree with that person, although you're happy, I'll give you the address, you can. It's a real issue. Am I just exploiting Annie to, you know, make a name for myself in writing a book? So, what's my, at least my cover story? You know, why do I write this book? Other than wanting to write a book, which all authors do, you know, what's the real reason? And the answer is that I think it helps people to know that secrets don't have to be damaging, that I can live with it, I can write about it. And the story I like to tell is the one of somebody who came up to me at a talk after one like this and was holding the book in her arms and said, I want you to know that we have a family secret. We've never been able to talk about it until recently. I saw your book, I read it, I brought it to Thanksgiving dinner, and I asked everybody in the family to read it, and then I asked them to talk about the secret. And it worked. It had never worked before for me saying this. And thank you for helping my family deal with something that it was unable to deal with. Now, if nobody else says that to me, I'm still a happy camper, because that's what I was trying, I wasn't trying to do that, that's an unusual story. But I was trying to say, let's get rid of these damaging secrets.
Well, I want you to know that our book club read that, your book, and at our discussion, I think every one of us shared a family secret. So you helped.
And they're still talking to each other? Thanks.
I think there comes a balance where you have to understand your sanctity for the family secret. That what happened. You and I as brothers don't have to agree on all of the details, and understand that your memory is different than mine. That doesn't mean you're wrong or I'm wrong, but I still have the validity of what happened while respecting yours. It doesn't mean I give it away. It's all well, it didn't happen. It must be you're right, I'm wrong. And understand that the power of the family secret is immense, okay? And that generations we'll still cover it up, still pretend that it didn't happen. But that doesn't mean that your understanding of it is invalid, okay?
Right.
And to mention it, to even bring it up, will bring backlashes, vitriol.
In
But-
some families it would, and
Yeah.
of course, that's a factor as
Yeah.
to whether you know, I mean, it's a risk to bring up anything that might cause
Yeah.
backlash. And
But it doesn't mean that I surrender to the old, what happened here stays here.
Well, clearly in America, what happened in Las Vegas no longer stays in Las Vegas. I think somebody was going to say something.
What did you find the most difficult in writing this book?
I think the most difficult thing was that I was somewhat prepared for being both a son and a writer at the same time. And I've long felt that, I've spoken at family history conferences, and I say, if you're not prepared to write the truth about whatever you find, I'm not saying you need to write everything, just generally write the very basic truths about a story, then don't go down the road, because readers know when you're not telling the truth. They know when you're pulling punches and that you're not being honest with them. Being emotional and angry about something is not the same thing as being honest, in my view. I mean, that you're really confronting the emotional truth of a story. And so I say, you don't have to do that. Nobody's requiring you. Just don't start, but don't write a story that you have to pull your punches in. So I was aware that I was going to have to be both a son and a writer at the same time, but I wasn't prepared for how difficult it was. Because writers need to stand back from pieces of writing and be crafts people. I mean, we have to be, that story's not working right. I need to move this here, I need to be dispassionate, why am I writing so much about that, etc. And when you have a personal stake in something, it's hard to be dispassionate. I mean, you're in conflict. So I found that very hard. It was also very hard to sit at the restaurant table with my cousin Anna and hear her damn my mother.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, even though you could argue I'm damning my mother by writing this book, but I'm not. I view this book as a book of understanding and not of judgment. But Anna was sitting in judgment of my mom, and I'm sitting there and saying, wait a minute, that's not why she did that, or that's not what she was feeling. And yet I'm holding my tongue because the journalist in me is saying, no, your job is to listen and take notes and not argue. And then I got back, and I still think that's right, but I got back to my house and I later on listened. I didn't record very many interviews, but I did record that one. And I'm transcribing it, and I'm listening to myself. I'm thinking, God, you did a terrible job of interviewing her. Why didn't you ask a question there? And I realized that she had put me totally off balance. And that, I went back and interviewed her several more times until she kicked me out and said, I won't ask, no. But we did have lots of interviews, but that was the hard part. I think that's a version of the son and the writer, because I wasn't behaving as I would have if I had been on a story for the Washington Post and I didn't have any personal stake in the matter.
Statement and question. First, I don't think you were exploiting your aunt. I think you actually gave her the face she didn't have, being shut away all those years, and people could feel some empathy for her, that you're telling her story. I don't think you were exploiting it. And the question I have is, we've heard about your brother, who at first disagreed. What about the rest of the family?
Well, he was the only one who actually had objections, if you will, or feelings. My younger brother, who's married to Dennis's sister, Dennis and Cindy are Sioux residents. These are my relatives, so I've had to be on good behavior. Because they're going to get a report back to Debbie and Jeff and tell them how I did. Jeff was curious, was interested. I don't think he would have taken it on himself, but he had no objections to it. I started at his house in some ways early on because we had divided some of the photographs up among family members, and he had a bunch of ones that I wanted to look at, and so I went to his house and we got the stuff out of the attic. So that meant he was involved in the process, and I think that helped. He never expressed any concerns. My sister, my half-sister, although I never call her that, she really wanted to write the book herself. She was more gung-ho than I was. And she would call me up and say, "What have you found out today?" And I said, "Sasha, I haven't found out anything today. Stop calling me." One more question, two more questions.
I would just like to say that I really thank you for sharing your story with us and making it possible for many other people to share their stories. One of the things that really hit me hard was, I noticed this in here, thank goodness, I can't remember the number, 7,441 graves in this Eloise Place, only 2 with names. And this is only one of our mental hospitals out there in Michigan, let alone across the country. And I find that, with your mom having to keep that secret, there was that many more people that also probably kept a secret, of that same nature, so.
And I'll talk a little bit, just very briefly, about that number. So my aunt is not buried among those.
No, I know she's at another cemetery.
But it's a potter's field more than a cemetery, because cemetery implies, to me at least, that there's kind of a defined area and maybe somebody maintaining the property, and there's none of that. It's a field that you can't even see the stones, the markers, unless you scratch away at the dirt to reveal this photograph. This is 804 is what it says. Eloise buried that number of people between 1910 and 1948 when it stopped. It had to bury them somewhere. Most of those people had family who either didn't pick them up when they died, or they didn't have family anymore. They were abandoned at the hospital. They buried them throughout the year, and one of the reasons why, they did note the names of the first 50 on the death certificates. So while there are only 2 markers with names, because let's face it, everything costs money, headstones are expensive, long names are expensive, dates are expensive, numbers are cheap. You can just serially pound out numbers. And so when the winter came along, Michigan winters are kind of cruel. They're crueler in the Sioux than they are in Detroit, but there was many months they could not bury people because they couldn't dig the ground up. And so they stored them in an ice house, and they buried them in the spring, and they did not bury them in the order of their deaths, so that while the death certificates were in order and chronological, they lost track of who the people were. So they couldn't reconstruct them. Joe Johnson tried to reconstruct it, and she couldn't do it. So you're right. There are many cemeteries around the country with similar fields, with similar markers, similar numbers. There's a place in Oregon where there's a crematorium with urns, and the urns are unidentified remains. And in 2009, in St. Elizabeth's Hospital, on the grounds of St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, the national mental health community dedicated a memorial to all of the unnamed people who are buried in mental health cemeteries around the country. And it had an inscription there from the founder of what later became the Mental Health Association of America, a man named Clifford Beers, who had been himself a patient in a mental hospital in Connecticut for a couple of years and came out, and his quote that they put on this memorial was, "I will fight in the open. I will fight in the open," because he thought that secrecy was the worst problem for mental illness. And that's what they chose for the memorial. I didn't ask them to do that. To support my talk about secrecy. Jim, you were going to say something.
Yeah, stand up so I can see better. Yeah, this whole thing, your book and your talk and everything has really brought out a lot of memories. We both worked in state hospitals for about a total of about 7 years, Kalamazoo and Newberry. And one of the things I keep thinking back to is you are so totally intensively focused on one person for obvious reasons. And I think back of being assigned a few hundred people as a social worker. I managed to get in 7 months in Newberry State Hospital, and the Army decided they needed to do more than the state hospital did during the heart of the Vietnam era, so I wasn't there very long. But I was assigned to all of the, what was then called mentally retarded adults in the hospital. And most of them so-called mildly to moderately retarded. And I picture her, I said, what if you had written a book about one of those women? and I would not remember them, except I might remember Annie because of the leg issue. But I think about, like doing intakes, so many intakes every month, plus having being assigned to a few hundred people, and I think the ward attendants got to know the patients. They're not even patients anymore. I mean, everything's changed. All mental health terminology becomes pejorative. It's like, I bet how many of you know that idiot, imbecile, and moron were legitimate psychological categories at one time for different levels of IQ level and so on. Everything, changes because it becomes pejorative. It's such that stigma and so on. But it kind of bothered me. I'm reading this, I figured, boy, if Annie had been assigned to me, if I'd been assigned to her or whatever, I might say, I kind of remember, sounds kind of familiar, or whatever.
Of course, your job wouldn't have been to know every patient.
Right. I mean, I got more involved with them, I think, than most people did because I did groups in the wards and so on. But I wanted to challenge you on something. I wasn't looking for things I thought you might not know, but I thought this is one you might be interested in, and maybe you don't know. Do you know what tidy means? You refer to patients people or whatever, who are tidy and comfortable being candidates for, do you know what the word tidy meant?
No.
Tidy meant one who does not soil oneself with feces. That was the specific institutional.
That was the shorthand for that.
Somebody who was untidy. Yeah.
I did not know that.
And I don't think that's a major omission in your book, but I just thought.
I'm going to call my wife tonight and say I'm tidy and comfortable. Okay, we're a little bit past time, so the library closes at 9, so I want to sign any books that are there to be signed, and I really appreciate you all coming. It's made my trip so I don't know, I have such great feelings about meeting all the people that I meet, and so you're now part of that. So thank you very much.